So since Easter, we've been in this sermon series called What Would Jesus Undo? And we're looking at each gospel, each account of Jesus' life, what happens after the resurrection, and what that tells us about something that Jesus might want to undo in our lives, or in our church, or in our world. And so we've looked at how the resurrection of Jesus means the undoing of death, the undoing of fear, the undoing of failure. And this morning we're looking at how Jesus' resurrection also signals the undoing of religion, which might be a surprise because Christianity is usually sort of lumped together in that category called religion. What we typically mean by religion is a set of rituals and rules that orient our lives to be aiming towards our sense of the divine. The other truth is that religion is not really a thing that anybody wants to claim in our culture. It's not exactly a good thing to be religious, which I can prove to you in just a moment. If I said to you that I was describing a friend of mine or someone you hadn't met, and I said, "He's so nice," that would be a good thing, right? What if I was introducing you to someone and I said, or I was describing someone to you and I said, "He's so religious"? You would think something different, wouldn't you? In our culture today, religion is something that's not exactly smiled upon. In fact, for people who were born in the last 20 years, they are twice as likely to say that they are atheist than the rest of the general population. So if you're someone who is, hypothetically speaking, employed by a religious institution, we have our work to do. Or maybe we don't. Because if what we mean by religion is this set of rituals and rules that somehow are supposed to orient us and get us to God, what we end up with most often is a set of empty rituals and crushing rules, and we've all probably had enough of condemnation and judgment. We've all probably had enough of religion in the bad sense. So maybe we should just leave it all behind. But maybe we can't leave it all behind, even if we try. Another way to think about religion has been suggested by the author David Zoll, who says that religion is that which we rely on for our sense of enoughness. I like that. Religion are the things we pursue that we think will make us feel like we're enough, that we have enough, that we are enough. And if that's a definition of religion that's accurate, and I think it is, then what that means is religion is actually much more common than we think. It's not a matter of if you're religious or how religious you are, what level of religion. It's what way are you religious? Because if religion is that which we rely on for our enoughness, then it's all kinds of things fill that bill. And in fact, what has happened in our culture is that this sense of religion, our religion has migrated out of the churches into other areas of life, like politics or parenting or love or relationships, diet, health, exercise. These things have become the things that we pursue that we hope will make us feel like we're enough. And because we don't think of them as religious or as religions, we pursue them with the kind of zeal that would make a Pharisee blush. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which is lovingly referred to by natives as the People's Republic of Boulder. In Boulder, almost nobody says they're religious, but it's one of the most religious places I've ever been. The orienting rituals and rule books, rules that you have to follow there, are around being really healthy and being really environmentally conscious, which is demonstrated by this picture I took a few years ago when I was back visiting. I'm not sure if this was ironic or serious. In Boulder, you can't quite tell. It says, "The fit shall inherit the earth." In Boulder, you can believe anything you want, but your diet had better be locally sourced and sustainable and compostable. This is also true of parenting. Right? It doesn't take long when you move into parenting that you discover that it is filled with intense doctrinal disputes. Like, should you give your children pacifiers or not? Right? Should you practice co-sleeping or should you let them cry it out? How should you discipline your child? If you say the wrong thing at a birthday party or a playgroup, you should prepare to experience the inquisition of parental religious zeal. Now, the thing is, all of these substitute religions, health, parenting, these are all good things. That's why they so easily trick us into thinking that if we pursue them, they will give us that sense of enoughness. And Jesus, I think, in his mercy, wants to undo religion in its typical sense of sort of spiritual performance and in its sense of social expectations. And we see this in this really interesting story that comes at the end of Luke's gospel, where these two disciples are walking home from Jerusalem to their home in Emmaus, which is this city a little ways away. Luke tells us that they're downcast because all of their hopes and expectations about this Messiah, Jesus, have been crushed by his crucifixion. And they've heard people saying that they've seen him again, but they don't know what to make of this. And so Luke tells us that as they're walking along the road, they're kind of processing this experience. And Jesus himself, the risen Jesus, sidles up next to them and starts walking with them, but they don't recognize him. And so he asks them what's going on, and they say, "Are you the only person who doesn't know what's happened in Jerusalem these last few days?" Which is beautiful irony, because Jesus is actually the only one who does know the truth of what really happened. So they're like, "Are you the only one who knows?" And they start to explain that we had all of these hopes in this guy Jesus, but he was crucified and he was buried, and we hear these stories, but we don't know what to make of it. And so this unrecognized Jesus speaks up in verse 25 of Luke chapter 24, which you can find on page 966. And he says this. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight, and they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. I think what we see in this passage is Jesus undoing religion by prioritizing relationship over ritual and rulebook. That signals the undoing of religion in its typical sense. Here's what I mean by that. Notice where they're going. This divine encounter happens as they are walking away from Jerusalem towards the city of Emmaus. Jerusalem was the center of religious observance. That was where the temple was. That was where the rituals happened. That's where the sacrifices were. That's where the priests worked. That was the place where you were expected to encounter God. And Jesus meets these two disciples, both of whom haven't heard about before, one of whom we don't even hear his name. These aren't in the core group of the 12 disciples. Jesus shows up to them not in the places of ritual and sacrifice, but along the dusty, dry road of disappointment, which is where a lot of us spend a lot of our time. That is where the encounter with Jesus happens, which shows us that Jesus is interested in much more than just the practice of religious ritual. Most of the time, I think our spiritual practices, when they move towards this kind of empty ritual, what's happened in our minds is that we've made a wrong assumption. We think about these rituals a little bit like the difference between cramming for a test and learning the material. I'm sure we have all practiced the time-honored ritual of the night before the exam, just filling your brain with facts about the French and Indian War or the Pythagorean theorem or whatever it is, so that you can perform well on the exam that's happening the next day. And that experience is pleasant for no one. Nobody likes that ritual. It is how I passed chemistry. But the other thing is, I literally could not tell you one accurate fact about chemistry today. I went through the whole ritual, I did the whole thing, and I completely missed the content. And it is very easy in our spiritual lives to do the same thing. For these rituals to take center stage, and when those rituals take center stage, we miss the point. We miss the content of it all. So maybe a better analogy for the way that these religious practices and rituals can function in our lives is like the ritual of washing and chopping vegetables and tidying up the house and setting the table because you're going to have some friends over. That ritual is an entirely different kind of thing, even though it's kind of a chore. You're not going through that ritual with some kind of apprehension because you need to do it in order to pass a test. You're doing that ritual out of expectation and excitement about a relationship that you're about to nurture and strengthen. That's how I think spiritual practices can function for us. Not as the kind of empty formality that we just go through because it's what we do, or because we think that if we do them, we'll be okay, we'll be enough, we'll pass the test. But these rituals can become the roadways, the entryways by which and through which we might encounter Jesus as we walk along the road of life. So Jesus undoes the significance and the centrality of ritual simply by where he shows up and where this encounter takes place. He also undoes the centrality of religious rule books. He does something very interesting with this. And one thing that religions, as we typically think about them, have in common is a set of rules of like, here's what you're supposed to do. If you do these things, you'll be okay. If you obey this way, you'll be enough. If you do these things, you'll pass the test. So in Judaism, it was understood to be in the Torah. The Muslim faith has the Quran. Buddhism has the Eightfold Path. Success Magazine has 10 tips to achieve anything you want in life. That's an amazing headline. There's only 10 tips. This is Success Magazine, so they know what they're talking about. But you would think with a headline like that, there'd be more than 24 comments. All of these religions, right? All of these things that promise that sense of enoughness have this set of instructions. This is what you have to do. But look at what Jesus does with the Old Testament. He says in verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. See, Jesus apparently thinks that those first 5 books of the Old Testament attributed to Moses and the 18 prophets that comprise most of the Old Testament were actually not so much primarily instructions as they were introductions. That somehow it's all about him. This is a surprising thing. He actually said this at another time in his ministry when he was meeting with the religious ritual and rulebook experts, and he was in a little bit of an argument with them. And he said to them in John chapter 5, he said this, "You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you possess eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life." So here too, we see Jesus undoing our expectations of what these scriptures are about. For Jesus, they're not so much this list of instructions or a series of stories that you have to memorize in order to be a good religious person. They are an introduction to a person. And he claims to be that person. So Jesus is undoing religion by prioritizing relationship. The kind of religion Jesus wants to undo is that ritual and those rules that are without relationship. And so that's why it's a perfect conclusion to the story that Jesus is recognized not in the temple of religious ritual, not even in the Bible study along the road, but the place where the disciples see him and recognize who he is at a dinner table in Emmaus. Not in the context of ritual or rule book, but in the context of relationship. That is where Jesus shows up. That is where he is recognized. That's the place where the encounter happens. And so the question for us is, do we just throw out all the ritual and rule book? Do we just forget about all of it? What is the function of prayer and Bible study and baptism and singing? What do these things mean? Well, you notice that in verse 33, those two disciples go back. They go back to Jerusalem. They go back to that center of religious ritual. They go back to the other 11 disciples. But they go back with all of that changed. The expectations are different. Their perception is different. Why? Because they realize that Jesus is risen. And so for these disciples, that transforms how they might go about their rituals and how they understand their rule books. If Jesus is risen, then religion is undone, but relationship with God is brought forth. Prayer, because Jesus is risen, is not just this sort of confusing religious practice. It's an opportunity to communicate with Jesus who is alive. Reading the Bible becomes not just this thing that you have to do in order to be a good Christian. It becomes filled with expectation because it's the way that we get to know who Jesus is and how we hear from him. You know, like gathering to worship at church is no longer just this practice that we do. It's an opportunity to recognize that we've been, as we've been reminded this morning through the baptism, that we've been adopted in to a whole new family. And so the tradition of Christianity becomes not just religious history, but our family story. All of this becomes possible because Jesus is risen and alive. And so what we can do now on the other side of the resurrection is look at those rituals and look at what we sometimes think of as a rule book and ask ourselves, where might I recognize Jesus? How might I bend these rituals or re-understand this book so that it's about relationship primarily? And if I do that, might I see Jesus in places I don't expect him? On this side of the resurrection, having undone religion, having put it to death and having raised to life again a new possibility, we are invited to look for Jesus in the ritual and in the books and in our lives on the road that we're walking, because he is alive. Because Jesus is risen, we can hope to recognize him, open our eyes to find him in places that we never thought. So we can worship and pray and study and serve with a new sense of expectation as we walk the road of life, because Jesus has shown us that that is where he shows up.